JD Vance this week was at the Munich Security Conference and used the opportunity to try and bring some of that Maga energy to Europe. This is something we've been seeing for some time already. Elon Musk has been trying to make Mega happen. Mega being make Europe great again. In an effort to kind of try and bring that particular brand of MAGA populism to both continental Europe and to Britain. There have also always been understandings that certain political parties in different countries, I mean particularly within Europe, have shared worldviews and shared objectives. That's very much the case within Europe, wherein within the European Parliament you get groups of parties sit together. You will get parties like the European Green Party, wherein you will get sort of parties that are part of larger groups and networks within sort of parties. So, for example, the Party of European Socialists includes the SDP in Germany, the Socialist Party in France, the Labour Party in the UK. However, for the most part, when it comes to national elections in other countries, political parties from each country tend to be a little bit cautious with getting involved because, you know, even if you are the Conservative Party in, I don't know, in the UK, for example, historically, at least in recent history, you've wanted to be a bit careful in terms of throwing too much support behind a similarly conservative party in another country, because if they don't win, you then potentially have really bad relations with the other party that now has one. JD Vance and Elon Musk have been being less cautious in that regard. So this week was the Munich Security Conference, which, in a world where a lot of things get described as Orwellian, the description of the Munich Security Conference as a security conference maybe is a bit Orwellian in terms of the kind of war is peace, etc. The Munich Security Conference is really sort of a conference which is about war and whether it's happening or not and in what ways it's happening each year. But JD Vance was invited to speak this year, and the broad assumption was that most of the speaking he was going to do was going to be about Ukraine and whether and how America was going to intervene in terms of either backing up military efforts in Ukraine or trying to bring about a peaceful solution, whether or not that involves Ukraine getting the rest of its country back, or whether that involves giving that stuff to giving those regions to Putin, etc. So it was always going to be a controversial speech in some ways. JD Vance did not use this speech as an opportunity to do that at all. He used it as an opportunity to really bring, or attempt to bring, some MAGA energy to Europe. And where it already exists, in, for example, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right German political party, which currently is second place in the polls, I believe. In that regard, the attempt is to really raise it up. So the AfD are currently sitting at 21% in the polls to the CDU, which is the Christian Democratic Union, which is Angela Merkel's old party. So the AfD have made some good, are looking quite strong in the polls. I think there is an attempt here to boost that a little bit, particularly with that election, but then more broadly with the to embolden far-right populists across Europe, whatever country they're in. But let's have a little look at some of his speech.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the gathered delegates and luminaries and media professionals, and thanks especially to the hosts of the Munich Security Conference for being able to put on such an incredible event. We're, of course, thrilled to be here. We're happy to be here. And, you know, one of the things...
Nothing says that you're happy to be there, like actively having to say, we're thrilled to be here. We're happy to be here.
That I wanted to talk about today is, of course, our shared values. And, you know, it's great to be back in Germany. As you heard earlier, I was here last year as United States Senator. I saw Foreign Secretary David Lammy and joked that both of us last year had different jobs than we have now. But now it's time for all of our countries, for all of those who have been
absolute Vance,
fortunate enough to be given political power by our respective peoples, to use it wisely to improve their lives.
There is a certain optics to, if you're going to do your kind of Western culture is collapsing speech, maybe the optics of doing it in Germany are not great. Probably just one of the locations I would avoid doing that speech.
4 hours, and I've been so impressed by the hospitality of the people, even of course as they're reeling from yesterday's horrendous attack. And the first time I was ever in Munich was with my wife, actually, who's here with me today, on a personal trip. And I've always loved the city of Munich, and I've always loved its people. And I just want to say that we're very moved, and our thoughts and prayers are with Munich and everybody affected by the evil inflicted on this beautiful community. We're thinking about you, we're praying for you, and we will certainly be rooting for you in the days and weeks to come.
Like, so far, so normal, right? There's been a horrific terrorist attack in Munich. The politician thing to do is to acknowledge it and say, yeah, that's really horrible. Sorry that you're going through this thing. We're sort of with you.
At this conference, of course, to discuss security. And normally, we mean threats to our external security. I see many great military leaders gathered here today. But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
Like, I cannot, stress how much of a wild statement that is. So, P63 in the chat saying, threat from within, where have I heard that before? UgDP saying, straight up Nazi shit, right? And there is also that aspect to it. But the fact that the thing that everyone was expecting him to talk about, and the thing that realistically they're all there to discuss, is the fact that Russia has invaded a European country, and they're sort of meant to be talking about that. That's very much really the point, the thing that they want to hear from the US administration about. And he's like, actually, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the enemies within. The reason that this speech has been so controversial is not just that kind of right-wing language of, the cultural rot within, the enemies within, and all of this kind of stuff. It is also the fact that he has specifically kind of brushed aside the thing that most of the people at this conference are worried about.
Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values.
That's another key theme of this speech, that throughout the speech he talks about America funding Europe, and particularly what he means in there is that he's talking about the fact that America puts money into NATO. But there is this really clear dynamic within this speech wherein, as a framing for everything else that he says, Vance is really keen to go, you know, we're doing all of this stuff for you. Don't take that for granted.
Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values, we must live them. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders...
There is something about all of these guys rocking up in their suits, in their military suits, expecting to talk about geopolitics and strategy and tanks and stuff, and actually getting this kind of values speech.
Or positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And
it's real, like all of the kids that are good at PE accidentally ending up in the history lecture and being like, oh.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissar wars. It's sometimes...
Like, beyond anything else, at least some of the mostly guys sat in this speech are currently thinking, I really came to this one instead of that other talk because this was like the keynote. And I thought this one was going to be good, but he's not managed tanks once.
It's not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action.
Like, coming to this particular conference and the focus of your speech not really being security at all, and actually just being about, like, the feminists have gone too far this time, is wild.
I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights.
Shout out, woo!
Has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes.
So this is one of... I'm going to jump in on this one because it's the UK, so I know a little bit about it. Effectively, the context for what has happened here is that, so there was a law which was introduced which introduced so-called buffer zones around abortion clinics in the UK and effectively said, like, you can't do your protest within a 150 meters of an abortion clinic, right? You are do it wherever else you would like to do it. However, you know, within 150 meters of an actual abortion clinic, like at that point, you are not protesting the political issue itself. You are directly intervening with people who are trying to access healthcare, and you are trying to stop that from happening, right? Smith Connor was convicted of breaching a safe zone in October last year after refusing repeated requests to move away from outside an abortion clinic in Bournemouth. The 51-year-old told the council the day before that he'd be carrying out a silent vigil as he had on previous occasions. On the day, a community officer spoke to him for an hour and 40 minutes and asked him to leave, but he refused. He was handed a 2-year conditional discharge in order to pay costs after the case was brought to trial. And, unsurprisingly, is receiving legal support from the Alliance Defending Freedom International, an American conservative Christian legal advocacy group that states it champions religious freedom through advocacy efforts. It's worth saying that support for abortion in the UK is pretty ironclad. 87% of Britons say abortion should be allowed in the UK compared to only 6% who say it should not. The presence of anti-abortion activists in the UK is extremely minimal. Those that do exist do tend to be heavily funded by the religious right in the US, who are trying to spread that into the UK, which is kind of an interesting aspect of this speech, is that JD Vance clearly thinks that this point about protesting abortion in particular might be a wedge issue in Europe, and there might be other countries possibly with a more recent and stronger kind of Catholic populations that might be true. In the UK, at the very least, sort of isn't so much so at all. Someone's saying in the chat that, there's a difference between European perception, sort of frameworks around free speech and American ones. And I think there are quite... there's a less extreme view around having no limits to sort of free speech in Europe broadly. Or less about having limits to free speech, but there is a greater recognition of the fact that someone always being able to say whatever they want, there can be negative consequences to that actually, right? Someone holding their protest outside within the 150 meters around an abortion clinic, at that point you are actively targeting people to harass them, to stop them getting an abortion. You're not making your political point. Go and protest outside Parliament. That is a thing that you can do. This is not that. And actually, there is a greater acceptance that, the way JD Vance talks about it is as though, it's starting with the buffer zone and then it's going to be everything. You can't pray against abortion anywhere. Whereas actually, no, the whole thing about it being a buffer zone is that you can do the thing elsewhere, right? Else it would... else that would just be the law that they'd passed. The fact it's a buffer zone is explicitly laying out the idea that, it's just this spot.
Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizen suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. And in the interest of comedy, my friends, but also in the interest of truth, I will admit that sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country, where the prior administration threatened and bullied social media companies to censor so-called misinformation. Misinformation like, for example, the idea that coronavirus had likely leaked from a laboratory in China. Our own government encouraged private companies to silence people who dared to utter.
Pretend to name something so funny, this comedy. Yeah, I'm not really sure exactly what the joke was. There is one aspect of this which does feel like a direct Elon Musk being like, hey, can you try and make it so that I don't have to adhere to certain rules in Europe. Like, it is really interesting that, you know, we've talked from a moment ago about the ways in which European and US models of speech and communicating with one another in a society differ. And what's kind of happening here is a real just attempt to impose that American model on Europe, particularly because there are all those American tech platforms who don't want to have to adhere to European rules, and an EU which has been much happier to take on the tech giants than in across multiple aspects, not just content moderation, than the US government has before as well as post-Trump.
What turned out to be an obvious truth. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree.
It's real, like, the sound of one hand clapping. There is this real thing of like, yeah, we'll let you have your disagreements on the thing, unless it's about this particular thing, in which case we've decided that that doesn't matter.
Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if you're
just like, we think that as well, promise. Totally promise.
Democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
That's not a awful point, right? That idea that actually maybe something has already gone awry if you are at a point where people are open to, you know, people are so distrusting of their government already that they are, and people feel kept out of things so much already that they are ready to be swayed by that. Like,
now, the good news is that I happen to think your democracies are substantially less brittle than many people apparently fear. And I really do believe that allowing our citizens to speak their mind will make them stronger still. Which, of course, brings us back to Munich, where the organizers of this very conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations. Now, again, we don't have to agree with everything or anything that people say. But when when political leaders represent an important constituency, it is incumbent upon us to at least participate in dialogue with them.
So to clarify, there's this idea in Germany of sort of the firewall against the far right, in which the main political parties, both left-leaning and right-leaning, as an inheritance of Germany's attempts to not allow Nazism to happen again, just refuse to work with the Alternative for Deutschland or the other. There's another far-right party that I've lost. Doesn't matter, because the main one now at the moment is the AfD. But basically, even if post an election, the AfD have the second greatest number of seats, for example, that they will attempt to work out so that the AfD aren't involved in government.
Now, this is a security conference, and I'm sure you all came here prepared to talk about how exactly you intend to increase defense spending over the next few years in line with some new target. And that's great, because as President Trump has made abundant...
That is a big part for people that are watching within Europe. Some of you will know this, some of you don't, but one of the big outcomes that people are expecting from this conference is probably that European countries will increase their defense spending. Keir Starmer has been, among some others, have been pushing for a kind of European peacekeeping mission. The idea sort of being that there'll be boots on the ground, which is what all of these people are there to discuss, to clarify again. The fact that JD Vance has come in and gone, oh, actually, I'm going to do this speech about kind of Western values or whatever, is wild.
Clear, he believes that our European friends must play a bigger role in the future of this continent. We don't think, you hear this term, burden sharing, but we think it's an important part of being in a shared alliance together that the Europeans step up while America focuses on areas of the world that are in great danger. But let me also ask you, how will you even begin to think through the kinds of budgeting questions if we don't know what it is that we're defending in the first place? I've heard a lot already in my conversations, and I've had many, many great conversations with many people gathered here in this room. I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for. What is the positive vision that animates this shared security compact that we all believe is so important?
But I think one of the things that J.D. Vance is doing here is a thing which the political right, particularly in the US, but elsewhere as well, has become quite adept at over the past few years, is this constant retreat into discussions of principle. In an instance where you are the Vice President of the United States and you are at a conference with a, particular topic to be discussed, you end up retreating away from talking about the actual thing and the nuts and bolts and policy, etc. The point which often gets made about, we have some people that are really keen on free speech in the abstract. You're not allowed to say anything anymore. And the question is always, okay, well, what is the thing that you want to say? And why are you so obsessed with this idea of free speech in the abstract is because you are worried that if you just go, well, I just want to say slurs or whatever it is, then that suddenly sounds insincere. But if you can have this sort of grand, I just believe in free speech in every scenario kind of conversation, it suddenly sounds a lot more palatable, right? What you end up, and a similar, if slightly different thing feels like it's happening here, because the topic they're all there to discuss is the fact that Russia is still in Ukraine, is still trying to take as much of it as possible. There are likely to be some peace talks happening. The discussion, that everyone's expecting is kind of about, if that happens, what is the settlement? Should that happen, or should countries wait until Russia has been expelled from Ukraine? All of the very complicated stuff around that scenario. And what JD Vance has managed to do is have this whole speech about kind of, well, what are we defending and all of this kind of stuff, which just ends up distracting from that main topic, and it's positive for him because it also manages to, he's in Germany and he can boost the AfD while he's there and all of this kind of stuff, but also has the benefit of managing to distract from talking about Russia having invaded a European country. Like, the idea that the greater threat in Europe right now is like these kind of fringe little mostly high principle kind of things, rather than one country has literally got a bunch of troops in the other country and is threatening to continue to expand in that way, is obviously kind of ludicrous, right? So yeah, I mean, and the other question is whether all of this is going to work, right? We talked earlier about the fact that this speech here is part of them, and as well as Vance's meeting with the AfD, is part of a much bigger push that we've seen towards a kind of mega, right? A make Europe great again. An attempt to take the energy of the Maga Republican movement and to channel it into Europe. My feeling is that it has some potential to be more successful in the short term than in the long term. We're currently still at a point where the Trump administration will have been seen to have made a lot of progress very quickly because Trump's got in, he's able to sign all these executive orders, change a bunch of stuff. That's likely to slow a little bit as the courts are able to pause stuff or block stuff, and as they get to the point where laws need to be passed through Congress, and maybe they go hardcore and they decide to ignore all of that stuff and they manage to push stuff through anyway. There are many branching paths here. A few years down the line, when it becomes time for elections in the UK or in other countries, whether or not the Trump campaign has been successful and America seems to be doing well, will have a big impact on whether that energy is useful in other countries. I mean, another thing it's worth saying is I looked up earlier sort of the popularity of Donald Trump and kind of his ilk in Europe, and he's not super popular. So if we look here, 3 in 5 Britons have a negative view of Donald Trump. So, and looking here, it's mostly people who are already saying that they're going to vote reform have a quite positive view of Donald Trump. Some conservatives, but even a lot of people who are conservative voters don't have a positive view of Trump. Most Labour supporters, there is the potential that actually a connection to Trump and a support from Trump for political parties in other countries isn't necessarily always helpful, right? That isn't to say that populist and insurgent parties in other countries might be having success. One of the things that we saw during the US election, and we've seen in elections across the world last year, was that incumbency, so already being in power, for many, many, many decades, has been seen to be a positive when you go into an election, right? Because if you're already the Prime Minister, if you're Keir Starmer, right, you're Prime Minister, and you go into an election, everyone knows who you are, they know what your name is. Yeah, they might not like some of the things that you've done, but they've got proof that you can do the job because you have done it for a bunch of years already. There's name recognition, also the fact that you kind of, even if you're not actively using the machinery of state to propagandize, you know, the fact that you are Prime Minister and you're on TV as Prime Minister as well as a candidate for the next election means you get a lot of airtime. And so for many, many decades, being the incumbent has been seen to be a really obvious positive going into an election. What we saw last year is that didn't help people. It was the third straight US presidential election in which the incumbent party lost, and it was one of many notable losses for incumbents around the world in 2024. So we are likely to see a lot of, and like people in a lot of countries are frustrated with not only the political party which is currently in power, but also kind of the main opposition. You know, we're seeing that in a lot of countries. And therefore we are likely to see success of insurgent populist parties like Reform in the UK, AfD in Germany. But the belief of Elon Musk, JD Vance, etc. seems to be that they can effectively just repeat exactly the same stuff in Europe than they've sort of exactly the same rhetoric and the same policies, etc. in Europe that have worked in America. Whereas actually, you know, the big question is, will that work? Does that work? Or does the populism which works in each country have to be different for it to work? And that'll be the thing, you know, does the Trump, Musk, Vance connection help those insurgent parties? Or does having a more tailored ideology and approach and strategy, is that more successful?